Victoria, welcome to the podcast. It is wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here in the virtual space chatting with you.
I adored Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and I'm so glad you're here to talk about it because it's honestly one of the most complex and kind of epic books I've read. And of course, it spans 3 centuries, so of course it's pretty epic anyway.
Yeah, it's an undertaking, isn't it?
It is an undertaking. That's a good word for it, but it's a beautiful undertaking. How would you describe Addie's story to people in a way that doesn't spoil the amazing things that happen across this book?
Yeah, the short version is that it's the story of a young woman in 18th century France who is living the kind of life where you look up and it's passing you by very quickly. You blink and 10 years are gone. And she starts to become very afraid that she's going to be born and buried in the same 10-meter plot. And she's coming to terms with the fact that she's not going to live the kind of life that she wants. And really, in her early 20s at this time, she's essentially considered a spinster, but at least she's going to be free in the sense that she's going to have bodily autonomy. And then somebody else in the village dies, leaving 3 young children and a widow. And the village essentially decides, oh, that's fine. Addie will step in. And all of a sudden, she finds that the one thing that she did have, this bodily autonomy, this choice to be alone, but herself, is taken away from her. And so, in a moment of desperation, she summons the devil and tries to make a deal, tries to get out of this unleavable situation that she finds herself in. And when the devil asks her what she wants, she essentially wants time, and she's not quite sure how to achieve that. And so she says that she wants to live forever. And because she just, she hasn't lived at all. And when you haven't lived at all you can think of is, I just want time to live. I don't want to put a time on that. Anyway, the devil says no, because it turns out that he doesn't get your soul until the deal is done. And if she lives forever, he'll never get her soul. And in a moment of absolute desperation, Addie LaRue says to the devil, you can have my soul when I don't want it anymore. And sensing an opportunity, the devil agrees and grants her the ability to live forever, and unbeknownst to her in that moment, curses her to be forgotten by everyone she meets, assuming, of course, that will wear down her will to survive. And so the book is her story over 300 years of trying to discover how to leave a mark on a world that doesn't remember her, and her story over 1 year in New York City when she meets a young man in a bookshop who does.
Which I have to say, now that you've actually said that part, I will say that just made my mouth drop open when that happened. It's like, wait, what happened?
Yeah. And it's interesting. I don't consider it so much a spoiler because there are really 2 timelines of the book. There's the 300 years and there's the 1 year. And so I think it's fair to say that this is a story of her life in both of those timelines.
Mm-hmm. What inspired this character for you? Because she's so dynamic, and I like how much you talk about embracing her power, really, because she didn't want that life and she wanted something more for herself, and she essentially went out and got it.
I really like the way you phrase that question, because everyone always asks, like, where did the inspiration for the book come from? But really, this is a book about Addie herself, and it was born out of my kind of approach to her character, because her character was going to be at the center of the story. And it came from, I wanted to tell an immortality tale, a Faustian bargain, and I was thinking about life and memory a lot. But for Addie specifically, in trying to tell a Faustian tale, I realized that men and women move through the world in different ways. I love Interview with a Vampire. I love these big immortality narratives, but they kind of become about existential ennui as it relates to men. As, they do everything, they live everything, they love everyone, they eat everything, and they become tired and bored. And I didn't want to give her that option. And she didn't get that option anyway, because women throughout history don't get to move through spaces in the same way. And so even without cursing her to be forgotten, she wouldn't have had that luxury. But on top of that, she has this curse in addition to her immortality. And so it really becomes a question of willpower. What kind of person survives, even thrives under this curse? And so I couldn't let her give in to existential ennui. I couldn't allow her to get bored. I couldn't make her the kind of person who bemoans their state for very long. I had to give her what I came to call a stubborn hope and a defiant joy. This belief that it is worth the pain of living, worth the discomfort of her situation, because there is so much living to do. And it has to be a life without ego in many ways, because she can't take credit for things even when she finds out how to influence them. She can't leave marks. She can't be remembered. It is essentially a very lonely existence, but she is so fiercely, stubbornly optimistic about the potential of life that she is able to carve her way through that. And so it really became about asking who thrives under these circumstances, because spite really only carries you so far, and hope has to carry you the rest of the way.
I think you touch on a central element for me in the book because, yes, in her early days of trying to navigate what this meant, wasn't awesome for her by a long shot because she wasn't understanding what was happening. She didn't know how to survive, and she figured it out. And as she moved on from there, she did become this very strong, hopeful. She always had hope, sometimes a little despair, but always hope. And that even made this the right book to read in these times that we live in,
Absolutely.
because she found a way through all this for hope to survive. And it's a good message now. I mean, it's always a good message, but particularly now.
I mean, that's the weirdest thing about it, right? I've been asked a lot over and over again, how does it feel to have the book coming out in this year, in this time, in this hellscape, whatever you want to call it? And I mean, at first I was devastated because I spent 10 years writing this book. And you have no idea what the world's going to look like when it releases, but this certainly isn't the year that I dreamed of for myself or for this story. You know, it was the biggest book of my career. My publisher had conceived of all of these extraordinary things for it, you know, parties and opportunities that I hadn't even dreamed of. I came up very small through books, and I grew just a little bit in scale with every book. This is book number 17, right? I had all of these incredible dreams for what would happen when I actually got to release Addie LaRue. And obviously, nothing about this year has gone as planned for anyone under
Mhm.
any circumstances. And I will admit that for a few months, I was just deeply sad. I was deeply sad for myself and for the story and for what I perceived as the missed opportunities. And then I began to realize, as advanced reviewers began to read this book, and as I saw them find some measure of solace in it and some measure of grounding as well as escape, and as I realized that this really was a story in so many ways about perseverance through difficult times and through holding on in the belief that the future will hold for you more incredible things, that this in many ways might be exactly the right year for Addie LaRue to hit shelves. And part of that is accepting that, like, books don't have an expiration date, right? This will always be the year that Addie LaRue began her journey in publication. That doesn't mean it will also be the end of that journey. But I do think that, you know, my own ego and feelings aside, I think perhaps this might exactly be the right time for this book.
I think it's why I didn't want it to end. I wanted to finish it before we talked, but I also didn't want it to end at the
Yeah.
same time because it was so good.
I mean, that's the difficult thing about writing a standalone as well. Like, I'm already starting to get asked by people like, so is there a sequel? And I'm like, no, like, that's the book. And I traditionally write series. Standalones are kind of the brief commas in the sentence of my career so far. But I felt so strongly from the beginning that this would be a standalone, but hopefully it's the kind of standalone that lends itself to rereading. Because I think when you hit the end of a book and you feel you need more, then that's the failing of the author. But if you hit the end of the book and you just really wish there was more, then that
Mhm.
is the best thing that the author can ask for, because then go back to the beginning and start again. Like, I want people to want more. I hope that people don't feel they need it more.
It's interesting to me, putting on my author hat, how you're approaching it as a standalone too, because of course there's so much in this story in Addie's life that you could mine for additional books because she does live for 300 years. And yet you're saying this is the story you wanted to tell. And so it is a standalone.
Yeah, I mean, almost to a T. So I mean, putting on author hats for a moment, right? I have a really hard time writing books. I have a really hard time with the drafting process, because when you have an idea, it's this beautiful glowing orb in your mind. It's pure potential energy. And the act of writing it down is like taking that beautiful glowing orb and smashing it against a wall. And what you're left with is kind of this broken, very mundane object that bears almost no resemblance to that beautiful thing in your mind. And then the act of revision is slowly, painstakingly piecing that orb back together. And it's never going to be the thing that was in your mind. But revision is the act of trying to bring it close to the authenticity of that thing. And I will say that whether or not people love this book, the final product is the closest thing to that glowing orb that I have ever achieved in my career. So it was very much meant to be the shape that it is.
Considering the two timelines that you've got, it's a pretty straight line in terms of the plot that goes on with Henry, because it is this year that
Yeah.
happens. But looking at the rest of the book and those hundreds of years before she got to Henry, how did
Mhm.
you decide what parts of history to let us see her in?
Oh, that's such a good question because it was not simple, right? Dealing with 300 years of history and travel, 'cause it's not as though she stays in one space. But at the same time, I didn't want this book to be a travel log. She doesn't just go everywhere. She is a person with an agenda and limitations because of her curse, and it does guide where she goes and when. So much of the kind of a year's worth of the work on this book was just figuring out that path through the past. And a lot of it, thematically I wanted it to go hand in hand with where she was at in her own emotional journey, where she was at. She kind of goes through a 5 stages of grief for her own life, right? And at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, she's going through stages of her relationship with the devil because they do over time have a very complicated relationship. He is, for centuries, the only person who remembers her. And they move through this arc of absolute hatred and animosity into antagonism and into something more camaraderie based because of the fact that they simply become the commonality in each other's lives. And so a lot of what I chose was based on where I wanted her to be emotionally and where I wanted her to be in relation to her relationship with the devil. And so obviously I knew there were some historical beats that I needed to hit, especially as a French woman, that Addie would be, she was going to be in Paris at the time of the salons. She was going to be in Paris at the time of the French Revolution. And I knew that there were some moments in art and culture that I were going to use to guide myself as well, because this is a book. I say it's like Forrest Gump, but for art and culture instead of politics, right? Which is that like she begins to graze up against art and history in that way. This becomes the way in which she can leave a mark. And so I started to look at when were there massive flourishes in Western Europe, especially because that's where I kind of confined her to in the beginning in art and culture. When was Vienna redesigned? When was Paris redesigned? When were these blossoms of beauty? Because that's a commonality between her and the devil as well. The devil sees himself as a patron of the arts and she becomes a muse. They both foster and are drawn to the hedonistic landscape. And so all of these things became factors. And there were obviously more places that I visited and researched than ever would make it into the book. And I think if I ever did write more, they would probably be more of Addie's past timeline. Not, I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that I can see myself writing beyond the timeline of the book in the future sense.
And I guess leads to the question of how much is on the cutting room floor?
You know, very little because I'm an additive author, meaning I tend to write very slim first drafts and then revision becomes a process of shoring them up. I think part of me is so anxious about not being able to pull off a draft that I simply like need to get bones down. But there were certainly ideas. I don't want to call them like I never got scenes that then got chopped entirely. They would always get repurposed or transformed. There were many pieces of dialogue between Addie and the devil that I had conceived of over years that never made it in, but obviously weren't right for the story because, writing a book over the course of 10 years means letting go of a lot of past iterations of story in your mind and past moments and not really forcing them simply because your ego wants them to be there. I would say that, it was more a sense of there were ideas that I had for two different scenes that needed to become fused into one. There were things that never really got to be on the paper in a full sense, so that didn't need to be fully cut. But I mean, the revision that I did between first draft and the second was massive. So there was a lot that got moved around. There was a lot that got revised, but I don't think things got wholesale excised from the narrative. And so it's harder for me to think of like what's missing.
It seems a very compelling thought exercise to work through how Addie adapted to life across the years, not just adapting to the idea that she is forgotten at every turn, but also just how women evolved over the centuries and what they could do, what they could not do, and how that must have seemed a very gradual progression to her.
Oh,
Having,
yeah. I feel like
you
she
know,
sees it through fashion, right? Like, she's so annoyed at female fashion all the time because it's so cumbersome. And she just wants to wear trousers. Like, she just wants to get to that point in history where she gets to wear something that feels like it is freedom. It is looser.
One of my favorite passages in the book is when she is impersonating the man.
Yeah.
Because it's an easier way for her to move through that moment. And the whole interplay that happens there was just really wonderful.
Yeah, I wish I could. I mean, here's the thing, and I have done this previously in books as somebody who has kind of a complicated relationship, not only to their sexuality, but to their gender identity. Like, I'm always tempted to put my female characters in menswear, to have them masquerading as a man, as an adaptive element, mostly because it's how I feel more comfortable. I did it with Delilah Bard and Shades of Magic, and I wanted to resist that temptation. And so what I did is I made Addie a very feminine looking person, just naturally, the kind of face that would not easily stand up to scrutiny and could not pass herself off, because it felt like it would have been the obvious solution to just have Addie spend 200 years masquerading as a young man. And so I gave her the features that would not allow that. And that's so we still get to have that moment with her, with Remy, where she's masquerading as a young man, but knows that this only works after dark, when she kind of keeps her distance and nobody looks too close. But I knew that I wanted to prevent myself from the comfort of being able to give her that option throughout history.
And how much research ended up in all of this? We hinted on it a little bit before, that you obviously had to research history. You've got to research places, and you've got this nice interplay between actual places, actual history, actual people, and then totally made up fictional material as well.
I mean, there was a lot of, I'm not gonna lie, there's a lot of research, but just as when you write a book and it goes through massive rounds of editing and yet somehow a typo ends up on that page, even though like 15 people read that book and looked for any problems, I feel like no matter how much research you do, there's like a late stage damn it moment. Like there is, and there's one that's in the book, I'm not going to say what it is, that's going to get corrected. And it was just, I don't know how it never got caught. When you're dealing with so much history, it feels like inevitable. But I remember in late stage revision, up until like, I don't know how I messed this up. I do know a great deal about France. I live here quite a lot of the time. But for some reason, maybe because I just can't fathom that Sacre-Cœur was that recent, originally, now in the book, she and Remy, this young man that she meets in Paris, go to Notre Dame. And originally, they went to the steps of Sacre-Cœur because I wanted to have that view over the city. And I didn't find out for some reason until like an actual advanced reader said, like none of the proofreaders caught it. I obviously didn't catch it, that Sacre-Cœur hadn't been built for like 100 years. Like in that moment, like it was a full century off. And all I could think was, oh my God. Like I read books upon books on the salon scene of the 1750s through 70s. I did so much work, and then something like that slips by. And so I think, I did do a huge amount of research for it. I also presented myself a challenge because I was dealing with setting as character in so many places, because I needed every place she go to feel like that place. For 10 years, Addie was in the backdrop of my mind as I would travel for work. And every time I would land in a city, in a country, I would ask myself, if I only had a page to convey the heart of this city, what would I say? And so it really became, because I knew that we were not going to spend very long in any one of those flashbacks. How could I distill a city down to a few essential ingredients?
Wow. And on top of the history, you've got all this art too. The art descriptions that appear at the beginning of each individual part. How did you pick your art? And was that always part of it, or did that come at some point later in the process of getting
The
it
art
written?
was always part of the story. Featuring the art pieces more didactically at the beginning of each part was a thing that happened in revision. So that was a decision made after the draft. But I knew I wanted the art to be crucial, because one of these themes that we explore is this concept that ideas are wilder than memories. And so Addie discovers over the narrative that she can nudge art, that she can influence artists. And at the time, several years ago, I was reading Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic, which is a book on creative examination and artistic. And I'm always fascinated by the personification of ideas. So like muses fascinate me, this idea of an origin for creativity. And I think, as a writer yourself, you'll know sometimes we can't track back to the exact thing that makes us think a thing, that makes us think another thing, and so on. We can't get all the way back to seed. And so I loved this idea that Addie might be that seed that some people can't remember exactly where those 3 notes at the beginning of that song that became the song that made them came from, that they just came to them on a wave of inspiration. And the whole question is like, well, what if there was a person? What if you woke up with those 3 notes in your head because Addie told them to you the night before, and Addie didn't stick in your mind, but those 3 chords did. Mm-hmm. And so I really wanted to explore that, especially because, okay, so this is how my brain comes from like 50 different places down to one idea. A couple of years ago, one of my best friends is a photographer, and we had gotten into a really in-depth discussion about how we pretend that photographs tell the truth. As a photographer, she was like, but that's not true at all, because like, not only, we weren't even talking about digital manipulation, but about how in choosing the lens and choosing what to show, the frame, what to show and what to exclude, the photographer is lying inherently. And this concept of visual truth would go on to inspire so much of the narrative, both from Henry, who has this interest in the lies that photographs tell, and in Addie, who I made the decision could not be captured by photograph or film, but could be interpreted and rendered through art. And so that became one of the concepts I really wanted to explore, which is, and one of the reasons that she has these 7 freckles, because I felt like you could erase so much of her, and that could be the thing which becomes interpreted, whether it's a wood sculpture of a bust with 7 holes drilled through, whether it's an abstract night sky that one of the artists makes with 7 star dots. I wanted this to be a thing of Addie could be interpreted through other people's eyes.
And it's a fascinating process as that happens various times through the book too, how that manifests herself and how she can nudge it.
Yeah. And it's interpretation, right? And it's also the thing that forces you to you can't have ego. And artists, there's always a measure of ego there. And Addie as the subject doesn't get to have that ego. She doesn't get to have that. But what she does get are these physical proof that she exists, that have followed her through history, and that she revisits, and that she thinks about these moments that are whenever she doubts her own veracity, whenever she doubts that she did these things, because memory is kind of one of those crazy things, memory and madness. And she has a flawless memory, but she has gone mad several times because of it. That these are almost anchors throughout her existence that track forward with her.
Among the many things I liked in this book is that Addie and Henry are so comfortably bisexual. Mm-hmm. Which is how we end up talking about this book on the Big Gay Fiction podcast.
Yeah.
And it totally makes sense for Addie to have had many loves through the years. But what led you to create the characters this way, and for both of the characters to be bisexual as the driving romance through that year of Addie and Henry?
I resist this concept of straight default. I just don't buy into it. And I would rather explore casual queerness in my stories, because one of the things I don't like is that so often when we include queer characters, that their queerness has to be a plot point. That's the reason for their inclusion in the narrative, is because they're gay or bisexual or queer. And I didn't want that. And so what I wanted to do in this narrative, because I knew that Addie was going to be in essentially a straight presenting relationship, was I wanted to make sure that I included space to say that neither one of them is straight, and that their past relationships obviously inform so much of their identity, but it's not because of the sexuality of those past relationships. And I wanted to normalize it. I think I just want to create that space where we need the normalization. We need to stop having these monolithic representations of queer identity. And the only way to do that is to have enough characters actually be queer. And it made sense, because it also feels like so often when we have queer character in the book, they're the unicorn. But as you know, we find community, we find our tribes, we form that found family. And I wanted, because Addie couldn't have that found family, I very much wanted Henry to have it. Plus, on top of that, there's just a massive amount of erasure of bisexual men. And I wanted to give him that. And I wanted to explore the spectrum. I didn't want everyone in the story to have to present one way. I didn't want to create confinement when there didn't need to be any confinement. And I thought that one of the ways in which I could do that was simply by having a casually queer presence throughout the entire story.
It's one of the things I love in books where it doesn't have to be explained, over explained, become a driving plot point, as you said. And what I really liked with Henry is that he managed to still be friends with his most recent
Yep.
male ex, who keeps coming back, who I swear has a tinge of jealousy running through him.
Oh, absolutely.
A
Absolutely. A possessiveness.
little
Um,
bit, yeah.
I mean, I love that. I didn't want Robbie to fall out of his life. And obviously, things get more complicated as the story goes on. I guess it was just, I didn't, to be honest, like, I didn't think about it with as much agenda as it sounds like as I'm presenting. I just wanted it to be there. I
Yeah,
wanted it to be there on the page because letting it just exist on the page allows somebody to come along and say, oh, a mirror, right? Because so often we're deprived mirrors. So often we make things exceptional. And by exceptional, it's a kind of othering, right? And I just want to be like, it's there. It's right there. You're there. Like, you're valid. This is valid. Everything's valid here. This isn't exceptional. This is just life. This is the world as it really is.
exactly. And for Addie to have lived hundreds of years, of course, she's going to run into all kinds of characters who would be marginalized, either because of the very time that they're in or over time that those characters would always be marginalized for some reason. And so they're
Also,
part of the fabric of life, which is
Also,
what
I just
makes it
call
so
bullshit
wonderful.
on the idea of Addie being straight. Like, there's just,
Well,
she, yeah, sure, she might have started out with like an aesthetic ideal of her love. She's 300 years old. Even if she
right.
didn't start, like, even if she wasn't born bisexual, the simple like desire to continue, she has such a voracious love of living and of exploring that the idea that she would have ever limited herself in that way is for her, like, it's more an organic assumption of, I'm sure she, she was born and raised in a time where that would not have been considered okay, and where it probably took 50 to 100 years for her to break down her own assumptions or what's, drilled in. But 300 years is a lot of time, and I
Oh,
refuse
yeah.
to believe that either of our three leads was ever really straight. I think about this. I know that straight people exist. I'm not trying to erase them, but I do think there's a lot of, conditioning that we experience in society that is something that then we have to take time to unpack for ourselves. I mean, I came out when I was 27, 28. So that means that, like, I was a very, very closeted gay teen who could not have told you, like, if you had asked me, I would have said I was straight because I hadn't done that unpacking yet. I hadn't done
Mhm.
that deconditioning yet. And so I think making space for that, it's wonderful to see kids and teens who already know that about themselves, but some of us take longer. And I just think I have such a resistance to checklist diversity, to this concept that we include people, but we include it for the wrong reasons. So it's like, if you're going to have queer representation, like, it better be intrinsic, it better feel authentic. You can't just be like, mention on page 52, oh, he's gay, because you want to like be able to say that you have queer representation. But I also think that there's a massive chasm between casual representation and like wanting a brownie point and making it the only reason that they're on the page, right? There's just a full
Mhm.
spectrum there of accountability that needs to be on our shoulders as creators to say, like, okay, like, how is it reflected in their character, and understanding, because we're not monolithic, that for some people their sexuality and gender representation is a massive part of their identity, and for some it's not. For me, I'd say that like my queerness is like 15% of me, right? Like, it just is not the driving thing in my life.
Well said. So this book was my first by you. And for
Oh,
me and maybe other listeners who are not familiar, tell us more about the books of both V.E. Schwab, which is the name you have on The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, but also Victoria Schwab.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. So yeah, so I write as both Victoria Schwab as V.E. Schwab. Traditionally, I've written as Victoria Schwab when I'm writing for children and teens, because I've got like a middle grade series called City of Ghosts, which is essentially about a 12-year-old girl who almost drowns and the ghost boy who saves her life. And now they're kind of inextricably connected and can cross the veil together and see the ghosts on the other side. And her parents are TV paranormal investigators, so they travel to the most haunted cities in the world. So the first book is set in Edinburgh, Scotland, the second one in Paris, France, and the third one in New Orleans. So things like that. And I write as Victoria Schwab. And as for my teen novels, I write as Victoria Schwab. And then on the adult side, I write as V.E. Schwab. And the very like PC answer is like, so that children don't stumble upon my adult work accidentally. And the very honest answer is that because adult science fiction and fantasy is a super sexist industry traditionally, and there's a lot of people who won't pick up a book if it's by a woman, which is something I get told often by my fans, which is really kind of a messy thing to unpack. But yeah, so
yes.
but I've written everything across the spectrum, from that City of Ghosts series to the Monsters of Verity books, which are in the YA space and really an examination of what happens when violence reaches a point in society that it begins to breed actual monsters. What if like the aftermath of violence is not just thoughts and prayers, not just, shell casings and smoke, but what happens if we as humans begin to usher forth incarnations of that violence? What does it mean? So probably I'm best known for my Shades of Magic series, which I write as V.E. Schwab, A Darker Shade of Magic, A Gathering of Shadows, and A Conjuring of Light, which are about a magician with the ability to move between alternate versions of London, officially as a messenger between the crowns and unofficially as a smuggler of rare artifacts. And he comes into possession of something he absolutely should not have. And before he can get rid of it, he gets his pocket picked by a cross-dressing thief named Delilah Bard. And the series unfolds from there. And so that's more like a love letter to Avatar: The Last Airbender and Full Metal Alchemist and elemental magic and just a lot of things that I'm deeply passionate about. Also a very queer series, which I love because I get to explore representation in different ways. And as the series continues, I'll get to continue to explore representation. And I just really like whenever I can have that representation in a fantasy context, because again, it's about normalizing. And when you write fantasy, you have the incredible luxury of getting to redefine what is normal. And there always have to be power dynamics and hierarchies, but you can write a world in which it doesn't have to be sexuality or race. It can be something else.
Obviously, I'm going to need to pick up more of your books. It's what it comes down to.
They're all a bit different, though. The one I guess I didn't talk about at all is Vicious. I wrote a supervillains series. So essentially, I wrote a series that's about the idea of like, if there are no heroes, who do you as the reader root for? So it's about two college students, Victor and Eli, who discover the key to superpowers are near-death experiences. And they set out to manufacture their own supernatural abilities by controlling their own deaths and resurrections. And everything goes heinously wrong.
Oh, wow. Now, I'm glad you mentioned that one because that sounds pretty amazing.
It's very much like Professor X and Magneto via The Boys Amazon series.
Oh, wow. Well, there's another book for the TBR.
Clearly don't sit still for very long. I don't like to write the same thing twice either.
So a friend of the podcast who is also an author was so crazy excited I was talking to you because she's a huge fan.
Aww.
And so I said, you could give me one question to ask her. So she came up with, she writes so beautifully. I'd love to know how she's gotten there to create such beautiful prose.
Oh my goodness. Practice is such a trite answer, so I'm not going to give that. What I will say is I come from poetry, and so I've always been very attentive to cadence and syllabolic rhythm. But the voice is the weirdest thing, right? Because you can't really teach it, but you also have to get better at it. And I will say that I think you almost learn the kind of prose that you want to write through exclusion. Like you kind of look at other people's writing and you say like, oh, I love that. And then you say, I don't love that, or this speaks to me, this doesn't. And then you just write a shit ton of words. Like I feel like, and I try to write differently. I definitely feel like I have a thing which makes my books mine, in that there is this kind of cadence or rhythm to it all. That's just the way I'm wired. I grew up on Shel Silverstein and William Blake and Baudelaire and all of these like really over the top poets who had a fascination with rhyme and rhythm. But I will say, like, I read a lot. And I read specifically out of my zone of what I write and out of my zone of assumptions of what I will like. So I probably read 100 to 120 books a year. And in that is everything from poetry to memoir, nonfiction, historical, fantasy, romance, sci-fi, literary, like everything, right? And I say this all to say that in reading, you feed this story monster. And in reading, you begin to develop, especially in reading broadly, you really just develop a sense of your own internal rhythm, your own internal voice and cadence. It's something that I feel like I'm so glad I don't have to teach, because I don't know how I would. And so looking at my own education in that way, it has been a product of write relentlessly and read voraciously.
Are there particular authors that you point to who are inspirations?
Anyone who follows me online knows I'm a massive Neil Gaiman fan and have been for a very long time. My family's English, so this is the weird reason that I became obsessed early on with Neil Gaiman, is that if you hear him ever narrate any of his work, which he does, there's such an incredibly lulling cadence to it, and his accent is almost identical to my family's accent. And so I grew up kind of like almost thinking of it as being told a bedtime story by a member of my family. There was just always kind of a wonderfully soothing, almost boat rocking rhythm to it. So Neil Gaiman is somebody whose work I have always admired, also because I admired the expansiveness of it when I was growing up and being told, like, oh, you need to pick. Are you going to be a poet? Are you going to be a novelist? Are you going to be a short story writer? Are you going to be a screenwriter? And then you see an author like Neil, a creative like Neil, who didn't pick and just does it all and manages to carry that voice, that very, very specific voice, through everything he does. I wanted to be able to do that, and I found that deeply inspiring. Also, I look to Diana Wynne Jones and to more recent ones like Erin Morgenstern or Susanna Clarke. I think Susanna Clarke sticks in my head because up until I read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I would have told you that was exactly the opposite of the kind of book that I like to read. It was really long and it had footnotes and it was really slow. And it was a book that made me eat my words. Like, I would have put on paper, it was everything I don't like in a book. And then I read it and I realized that you can pull off anything as long as you do it well. So I think I've taken different things from different authors that I admire, whether it's their world building or their voice or their like ambition. And it's constantly changing every year. But I would say, like, on my shelves, it's like Neil Gaiman, Donna Tartt, Diana Wynne Jones. Yeah, those are probably my triptych, my trifecta.
And speaking of books, what's something you've read recently that you would recommend to this audience?
Okay, so probably my favorite book of the year is so counter to what I normally read, and it just shows you what a hellscape this year is. Because I normally go to like the very dark, the very kind of like Dexter-esque, or the just like sinister stories. I read a book this year called The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune.
Oh, so good.
It's like a big gay sweater, right? It is like a cozy, happy, heartwarming, beautiful, kind book. And I've been recommending it to everyone that I know.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. It's certainly in my top books of the year, and I can't envision anything coming out that's going to knock it off the top slot for the year for me.
It's just wonderful. I mean, and
Yeah.
it's wonderful. And my mom read it and she loved it. My dad read it and he's such a difficult reader and he loved it. Like, I've yet to meet someone who didn't respond to it.
Yeah, tremendous book. What can you tell us about what might be coming up for you next?
Oh my God, it's always an ordeal. We were talking earlier about not giving away secrets between like what I'm allowed to say and what I'm not. What I can say is that the third book in my City of Ghosts series, my middle grade series, comes out in March, called Bridge of Souls. And I'm writing a comic book series set in the vicious world called Extraordinary. And I'm working on the next book in the Shades of Magic series, because there were like 2 arcs. So the first 3 books came out and now the second 3 I'm working on. And I've just finished drafting. So the work has really just started on a book that I haven't been allowed to reveal yet, but that I've been saying is The Secret Garden meets Crimson Peak.
That's an interesting combo.
Like the next year.
What's it like adapting for comic book?
I love it. Well, and I'm not really adapting because it's new stories set in the world that I've already made.
Okay.
I'm simply adapting what I've already written. I think that would be easier and I would love that a lot. But I'm creating new content. I had written in the Shades of Magic universe a comic book series called Steel Prince that was 12 issues and that just finished. And I loved it. And so now doing that again, I just think translating to a visual medium is so nice because writing can be intensely lonely and visual mediums require collaboration. So it's just kind of an open conversation, and you're working and then you get to see art. It's basically like professionally commissioned fan art. It just kind of ticks all of those delightful creative boxes.
Mm-hmm. I love seeing authors get involved in different types of adaptations and universe expansions like that. It's always exciting.
Yeah, I love it. It just is different. They're different flavors.
And how can people keep up with you online to keep track of all this stuff that's coming next?
The best way to find me on the internet is that I basically live on Instagram. And so I'm just VE Schwab, VESCHWAB over there. I post almost every day, usually more than once a day in the stories, but every day. And it's just like the easiest way to keep up with everything from whatever I have in the works to, I do talk a lot about creativity and like the creative hurdles and headspace and anxiety. And I also, talk about my kitten and random stupid things in my life. So like there's a good balance there of just like neuroses and creativity and like pictures of my pets.
Perfect. We will link to that and everything else that we've talked about in our show notes for the episode. So everybody will be able to find what they need from that. Victoria, it has been so awesome talking to you. Congratulations on the release of Addie LaRue, and can't wait to see what you come out with next.
Thank you so much.